Good morning and welcome to Rising. We inadvertently color coordinated today, which is always a good sign that we have a great show ahead of us.
Indeed, Robby. We'll discuss Arizona Senate candidate Blake Masters' affirmative action regime comments about diversity at the Fed with friends of the show Will Jawando and Denise Long, and Jordan Charrington discusses the water crisis hitting residents of Jackson, Mississippi. Plus, Aaron Mate is back with some of his latest reporting on Ukraine. You won't want to miss that. But first, Biden previewed his Safer America plan yesterday in Pennsylvania and vowed further police funding. Let's watch.
When it comes to public safety in this nation, the answer is not defund the police, it's fund the police. Fund the police. And give them, we expect them to do everything. We expect them to protect us, to be psychologists, and to be sociologists. I mean, we expect you to do everything.
For some context, the American Rescue Plan signed into law last year sent $350 billion to local governments for their police budgets, in contrast to former President Trump, who cut police budgets by $400 billion for state and local law enforcement. So here's the rub. It seems like Joe Biden is funding the police harder than anyone could ever fund them, in contrast to recent Republican leadership. But he's still getting pegged with this association with the defund the police movement. What's going on?
It was never persuasive when Republicans tried to paint Joe Biden as like part of the defund the police is, I think, not a good tactical slogan for anyone, but it's not one at all that Joe Biden embraced. And more importantly than what slogan he uses, his literal actions contradict it. He does want to fund the police. He is a pro-policing Democrat. I was listening to these remarks yesterday, thinking how much they would be triggering you, and it's exactly the opposite of what you feel Democrats should be advising. I mean, I see it. I think this is popular, this kind of framing of police issues this way, and I know that many people in their communities, even communities that have been affected by overly aggressive policing, also feel like safety and crime and violence are an issue and are not necessarily so against the police the way it's sometimes portrayed. You know, all of that said, I've made my feelings clear on the show numerous times. I am also skeptical, as you are, that incincreasing funding for police does.
The skepticism is rooted in reality and statistics. So, you know, you're right. The slogan, if you will, of defund the police was a slogan that came out of the activist community, and I think is well suited for the activist community. However, when you poll people on whether or not they support transferring funds toward the very social services that Biden points out in his remarks, right? He's like, we expect police to be social workers and EMTs and these kinds of things. Well, that is fundamentally the problem, that we expect all these things of police, and they're not trained to actually do that job. They're trained to have guns and shoot, and not every situation demands that. A very small fraction of causes for which police are called have to do with violent crime and the kinds of things we typically associate with police behavior. So why not, people say, shift funds toward the kind of training in individuals that can service the communities that need exactly the kind of services you described.
And by giving the police more funding, sometimes that means giving them tanks, giving them SWAT equipment, things they use not for greater public safety, but for theft.
And then meanwhile, we get Uvalde.
Right, we get Uvalde. Then when a situation that calls for that, which they've been prepared for and trained for, they disappoint us. They let us down. And meanwhile, so many Americans dealing with civil asset forfeiture, the practice, police investigating, going into your home, they take your stuff, they take your car. If they find cash, they take it. And then the standard for getting, you have to prove to them, even if you're never convicted of a crime, you can't get this stuff back. So I absolutely understand why a lot of Americans feel harassed by the police. I mean, I think it's an issue of, I think it's often wrongly framed by the left, or not wrongly, but tactically unsound as predominantly a race issue, when it should be, to my mind, it's a government accountability issue. They work for us. We are forced to fund. You don't have an option for whether you fund the police. It's not like hiring a security guard or something. If you don't like whether you fire or get a new security guard. We are forced to give them money, and they should. So there should be more accountability for them, and there's more protection for bad behavior, from qualified immunity, from they're unionized. The way that these, I think even people on the left who are generally supportive of unions see how in this specific employee sector, union incentives have been very, very perverse.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so now Joe Biden is out here, I think, making a case that appeals to very few people who actually stand any chance of voting for him or supporting him politically. And it's really unclear who he thinks this is for.
Well, I think it's for, I don't know if I agree with that. I think it is for, moderate people, which are more of the country than, can come through in the talk pundit sphere where everybody has, pretty intense opinions.
Who is the person who's on the fence about voting for Joe Biden? But the fact that he is doubling down on being pro-police funding when he has a long career. For
someone who's wavering on voting for Democrats because they're concerned about crime, and then looks at Republicans and goes, "Oh, but I find Republicans very weird," is reassured when Joe Biden says something like this. I mean, maybe not, but I assume that's his strategy, and he has some competent people at least running his campaign.
Are you so sure about that?
Well, I don't know. You tell me that's not the case, but
I think that the people
kinds
of centrists who like this kind of messaging are going to vote for Joe Biden no matter what. And I think that 20 million people were in the street the summer that he was elected, calling for the opposite of what he's elevating right now in those kinds of remarks. And he could say less or give more targeted responses to specific conservative audiences that he wants to address. But coming on the national stage and reminding so many people why they only voted for him begrudgingly because they didn't like Trump is a bad idea, especially if we're not confident that he's actually going to go up against Trump again, and that fear-mongering doesn't land in quite the same way.
I mean, the party of skepticism of law enforcement in some weird ways, in some very broad ways right now, is the Republican Party.
Abolish the FBI.
Abolish the FBI. I think Ted Cruz was caught saying it. I think we have actually footage of Biden talking about, can we play that?
Oh, it's sickening to see the new attacks on the FBI, threatening the life of law enforcement agents and their families for simply carrying out the law and doing their job. Look, I want to say this as clear as I can. There's no place in this country, no place, for endangering the lives of law enforcement. No place. None, never, period. I'm opposed to defunding the police. I'm also opposed to defunding the FBI.
That's got to be daggers into your heart, Briahna.
It's so funny. During all of the student debt discourse last week, the response from the White House was so similar to my Wednesday radar that I was joking to friends, oh, they must have been watching. And now I feel like that's obviously not the case. Or they were watching and they just strongly disagree with my take.
Yeah, Republicans are criticizing the FBI, some of our surveillance state. It's a little cynical because Republican political figures now feel like law enforcement structurally is not on their side.
Yeah.
They're still going to say back the blue. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. They're still going to say back the blue, back your local community cops. They're saying the system is out to get Donald Trump, is out to get Republicans, which is not a totally ridiculous claim whatsoever, given what we're learning about how the FBI handled the Hunter Biden probe. To be fair,
and it is in fact the same. I'm sorry, there is a part of the right that really hates the word system or systemic. But what they're describing with the FBI, the systemic issues with it and the systemic corruption, regardless of whether or not you think it's correct in this one instance of investigating Trump, is exactly what other marginalized groups have been saying for years. That it's not about that specific cop being a jerk or ACAB or any of these kinds of things. We all have people, people who are central to the left movement, like Nina Turner, come from families of police officers. Many of us have police officers in our lives. It's not that personal kind of attack that it's always been framed as. It is whether or not these people are being empowered and put in the best situation to interact with the communities they're supposed to protect and serve, or whether or not these systems are making them have this antagonistic relationship that's having all of these terrible outcomes.
And here's the Ted Cruz comments that I alluded to earlier. Let's watch those.
I wanted to say thank you so much for all you're doing to fight for the longer and to take back the Senate. And I just think it's so important that you guys actually do defund all those IRS agents.
Absolutely.
But I think it's imperative that you really have to defund the FBI after all the witch hunts that are going on.
It is horrific, the abuse of power at the FBI, and it's wrong. And there needs to be a complete house cleaning that happens at the FBI.
Are y'all going to be able to do that when you retake the Senate?
I think we need to fight to do that. We need to fight to have real oversight.
All right, I guess he didn't really say actually shut down or defund the FBI. He said house clean. What he's suggesting is we need to get rid of the the officials at the FBI who are hostile to
people were pointing
but
to like what they perceived to be a nod, as she was saying, to fund the FBI, as him corroborating that.
I mean, somebody comes up to you, talks to you at an event. I nod along to what they're saying. Honestly, even if what they're saying is totally insane, I nod along because I want to have a pleasant interaction and move on to my next interaction.
Yeah.
But
for sure, but it is interesting to see if this kind of pressure on public officials in this way, both privately and on a more public stage, will yield some results. And this is what I was, saying in the course of my my remarks about this. To the extent that there's any momentum behind this movement that lasts more than this month's news cycle, it would behoove those who have a sincere interest in FBI reform to put something on the table so that it can be shaped in their image. If leftists have their own view of what reform looks like, that doesn't mean diminishing accountability for people who are actually powerful and elites like Donald Trump, and instead is trying to curb the abuses against the people that the FBI normally attacks, who are much more marginal figures, then they should put forward that legislation and not leave it up to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world.
Joe Biden also made some remarks about guns that I wanted to respond to.
And for those brave right-wing Americans who say it's all about keeping America's independent and safe, if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something a little more than a gun. No, I'm not joking. Think about this. Think about the rationale that's used to provide this, and who they're shooting at. Shooting at these guys behind me. So let me say this to my MAGA Republican friends in Congress. Don't tell me you support law enforcement if you won't condemn what happened on the 6th.
So I wanted to respond to the first part of that, which I think is completely wrong, and I often hear this argument, and I just think it's so wrong. So this is the argument that some gun control people make. Will say, okay, the purpose of the Second Amendment is so you can have a militia, you can have people take up arms against a hostile government, including our own government. That's why the founders thought it was important to let the people have guns. But then gun control people will say, but that's ridiculous. But you could not successfully defeat our government or another government with an armed populace because our government has missiles and planes and everything. But that's not true, because our government has lost over and over again in trying to invade and occupy Vietnam, Afghanistan. Armed guerrilla fighter type people have repelled the American government and other government, highly organized governments. It's very hard to occupy hostile territory. You can destroy every building. We destroyed every building on the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War. Still, it didn't mean we were winning, right? People can repel and defeat. I mean, it's horrible, but through attrition, and you can make it so difficult that an invading, occupying force eventually gives up. So that whole unless you could have people have their own planes, it wouldn't even be worth it. Is like that's not true.
Sure, that's funny. I mean, I don't disagree, but I actually was going to criticize that from the opposite direction, insofar as it feels like Biden is making the argument of Second Amendment advocates who say this is exactly what. If Biden is saying, well, you need bigger weapons and more powerful weapons.
Some Second Amendments would say, yes, that is also covered under the.
That is why I need weapons of war. That's why I need all of these automatic weapons that keep getting involved in these mass shootings.
Yeah, you're right. It was wrong in both ways. Both directions, Biden is wrong. Surprise, surprise. Okay, we'll tell you what's on Briahna's radar coming up next.